Hello, hello, testing, testing. All right, guys. Hey, welcome, welcome, welcome to my show. My name is Aaron Lynch, and what the show is going to be about is music, all things music, rock music specifically, which I'd like to consider my forte and really what I'm most passionate about. Um, I'm a freshman here at Iona, um, and like I said, music's sort of my passion, especially rock music, classic rock, classic metal. So if you're into that, this really is the perfect show for you. Um, so I've decided to name this show "Getting in Tune," named, of course, after the phenomenal song by the band The Who. Personally, I think it's one of their best songs, at least on their Who's Next album. Um, where I mean, that whole album is just perfect front to back. But we'll have many opportunities to get into The Who. But, anyways, I'd like to say, um, I like I said, the show is primarily gonna be about some classic rock, anything really from, the '60s up, throughout the '90s. Maybe touch on some 2000s stuff, but that's a little out of my range. Um, we'll talk about any new music or any new news in the rock scene. I'll talk about some of my favorite bands, some of my favorite musicians. Maybe one week I'll talk about, maybe one band or album in particular. But we have time to figure this all out. But we'll just keep the show very loose and talk about some good music and yeah, some good rock. But a little about myself. Like I said, my name's Aaron Lynch. I'm a freshman here at Iona. I don't technically have a major at the moment, but I am desiring to pursue education with focus in history. So that's that. I play guitar, I play bass, and I play drums. Trying to learn piano at the moment, but I wouldn't say I play piano. I wouldn't go that far, but I'm trying it out. See, I'm learning a few songs here and there. But yeah, I'm a musician. So, anybody that's, you know, also a musician and you're looking to, want to play with somebody, just want to talk about music, come talk to me. Come talk to me about playing, find me on campus, whatever. But yeah, I play guitar, I play bass, I play drums. I do write some stuff. I'm not a big I wouldn't say I'm great. I can't sing, but I do write some riffs here and there, some little songs, but yeah, I guess let's get into the show. I guess the first thing I want to talk about is this past Sunday, I went to a concert at the Garden and I saw one of my personal favorite musicians. I got to see Eric Clapton. Now, the show was phenomenal. It was amazing. I mean, I've never, I told this to I went with my friend and we literally looked at each other and we said the whole night like we've never seen, we're both fans of this type of music. We've never seen guitar playing like that in person in our life. Like we've never seen anything like it. Every single guitar solo this man played throughout the whole night was like just incredible. It was almost hard to believe how great of a guitar player this guy still is. I mean, the man's 77. I believe he's 77, and he's playing as good as he did. I don't. Maybe that's a stretch, but he's playing as good as he did. In the '70s, maybe, or maybe even the '80s. But the show was phenomenal. It was I do have 2 gripes with the show. Um, one is that, there's a song he played, one of his signature songs with a band he played with a band back in the '70s called Derek and the Dominoes, and, their signature song is called "Layla," and he did play the song live, but he did an acoustic version of the song, which I mean, it's good. I mean, he recorded the acoustic version in the '90s for that MTV Unplugged thing, whatever, and it's good, but it's just not the definitive version of the song. It isn't. I mean, that's popular opinion. People just know that, but it was great. It's the acoustic version isn't anything to it's not. It wasn't bad. It was good. I was expecting, the electric because the original version is really it's one of the greatest, in my opinion, guitar riffs of all time. It had an amazing solo by Dwayne Allman, God rest his soul, but, and it had that, huge piano and guitar opus, that whole second half of the song, which I was sad I didn't get to see, but it was good for what it was. So that was my first gripe with the show. And the second one was and this one really surprised me. The show was incredibly low in volume. I mean, like me and my friend, like, we could hold, like, a conversation at normal volume throughout the whole show, and it was at the Garden. You would expect it's an arena, you would expect the concert to be, loud for the most part, but it was so odd because, like, you would expect I mean, granted, Eric Clapton, he's old, that's no surprise, but, also, he's losing his hearing. He's like Pete Townsend of The Who in that, like, obviously he played crazy loud concerts back in the '70s and '60s, that, it's inevitable to for your hearing to go out. And I noticed he wasn't playing with in-ear monitors, so it's natural to assume, that the concert would be lower in volume for him. But I also I did see The Who, earlier this year, and their concert was really loud, and Pete Townsend is the guitar player of The Who, is essentially deaf. Um, but yeah, the Clapton concert was incredibly low in volume, which really, like, disappointed me. I'm a fan of loud music. My parents always yell at me because the music is way too loud in my headphones all the time. I love loud music, especially at a concert. I want the music to be loud. But, it's what are you gonna do? And, I was talking to my girlfriend who also happened to be at the concert, and she actually brought up a very interesting point that really made me appreciate the fact that it wasn't that loud in volume, and it was, she said that, it made it seem like Eric Clapton wanted you to, sit down and listen to what he was doing. He wanted you to listen to what he was playing. He really wanted you to focus on the music. The show, there really were no frills. There was no pyro. There was really no light show at all. It was just a bunch of guys on stage. There were screens and things so you could see everything, but there really was no, complex technical show he put on. But excuse me. But yeah, that did make me appreciate. She also said it really felt like in a sense that he was sort of playing to you rather than for this huge audience. It made it feel like he was playing for a much intimate environment. Like she said, it almost made it feel like he was playing like in your living room or something. Which that was a very great way of looking at it. I really didn't think about that, and it totally made me appreciate the fact that the concert was a little I don't know. It really wasn't too loud, but which is fine, but it that did make me appreciate, she really did make me appreciate that, because I was pretty annoyed at that, but like I said, she really made me appreciate that. She's, pretty good at doing that sort of thing, but yeah, Clapton is, commonly referred to as one of the greatest guitar players of all time. I can't really disagree with that. I would say I have the unpopular opinion that he's a little overrated, just a little. People, say, especially Rolling Stone magazine, they're always, pumping that guy up there with Hendrix, but you know, top 5 guitar player, yeah, sure. I wouldn't say he's like there are definitely, I believe, guitar players that are better than him. People say he's, Clapton's God. There was that whole phrase in the '60s and, pretty much up until now. And he's great. He was amazing. Like I said, the guitar work during that whole show, 77-year-old man blew me away. I play guitar. It's really easy for me to appreciate great guitar playing, and that was beyond great. Um, so I guess it's tough for me to say that I think he's a little overrated because I never really got to see, he's the closest thing I'm ever going to get to a Jimi Hendrix or a Jimmy Page. Like I'll never see Led Zeppelin, I'll never see um, Jimi Hendrix. So that's the closest I'm ever getting to one of those greats, and he is one of those greats. Um, it was it was phenomenal. Now there was a very rich history um, of the all the music and all the bands Clapton was involved with. The first band Clapton was involved with was called the Yardbirds, and now I'd say that that band is probably the most. This might be a little controversial to you rock fans, but that band is probably the most influential band ever. You know, at least for a guitar player like myself, because you have to look at who came through that band. There are three different guitar players that came through that band, and if you know guitar players, this will pretty much uh, it blew my mind. You had Eric Clapton was the first guitar player in that band. Then after Clapton left, you had Jeff Beck, and then after Jeff Beck, you had Jimmy Page. And if you know guitar playing, that is the holy trio right there. That's literally that's as good as guitar players can get. And then you say, well, what about Jimi Hendrix? He was an alien. He was, everybody, even those guys in the Yardbirds and, Pete Townsend of The Who and all those guys back then, Peter Green, they all looked at Hendrix as the best. Like they saw Hendrix one night and they were like, well, we're out of a job. Like we can't keep up with this guy. Um, but that Hendrix was above everybody and always will be above everybody. But those three are the greatest. And they all came through the same band. Um, and then Clapton was in the band for the shortest amount of time. It was during you know, he formed the band with them, and he left after only a few months or something like that. And and all three of these guitar players came through the band within a span of 2 or 3 years, maybe, which is insane. Everything back then, all the bands back then, the scene was so just rich and impactful that like you didn't need a lot of time to, make such a huge impact on music. Um, and we'll talk about some of the bands that, back then, only lasted a few years. Some of the greatest bands of all time only lasted a few years, which is it's tough to believe, but it's crazy the amount of material they put out in such a short time while still having the impact, with that amount of material. So after the Yardbirds, Clapton left and he played with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. That was a band. And he was in that band again for a short amount of time. And then after that, he joined a band or formed a band. I'm not pretty sure, but he was in a band called Cream, um, which at this point they're considered one of the most influential bands of the '60s. Some say one of the greatest bands of all time. Totally agree. You had Eric Clapton on guitar, Jack Bruce on bass and vocals, and then you had Ginger Baker on drums. That's it's considered a super group by a lot of people, and I totally agree. That was really where Clapton found his footing. That's where he captured a lot of people. I mean, you just listen to Cream stuff, and if you're not a rock fan, you're not really into this sort of stuff. You don't even know who Cream is. You've heard Cream's songs. That's the type of band they are. They just have those songs and riffs that are just, everybody knows them. Songs like "Sunshine of Your Love," "White Room," "Crossroads," maybe, even though they didn't write that, but yeah, he joined Cream, and Cream had such a huge impact in the '60s that they were really that band that you think of, or when you think of psychedelic rock, you think of Cream, even though you might not know who Cream is. Cream is that band, um, along with the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Those are those two psychedelic bands. That's where Clapton really found his, like I said, where he really found his footing as a rock star. That's where he really, went off into the stratosphere. Um, and then after Cream, he eventually formed a band called Derek and the Dominoes, which was a phenomenal band. Could have been, an even greater band, but unfortunately they disband after only one album. It was a phenomenal album. It's one of my favorite albums. But that's the album that had that song Layla on it. Um, it had Bell Bottom Blues, Key to the Highway, Thorn Tree in the Garden, great stuff. But it's only one album, and it was a phenomenal band. But I would have loved to see where they can go. After that one album. And then after Derek and the Dominoes, he went solo. And then that's where, people that's where he the thing about Clapton is he was much more of a rock star in the '60s, and then into the '70s, he was more of a pop star, because he had songs like After Midnight and the whole Slow Hand album. There are some hard rockers on there like, Cocaine and, The Core and songs like that, but, there are also songs on it like Wonderful Tonight and We're All the Way and May You Never, which, you know, he's a rock artist, but you listen to those songs, those are '70s pop tunes, they're acoustic, he was more of a pop star, you know, in the '70s rather than a rock star like he was in the '60s. He cut his hair, he did all that stuff. Um, but going back to the Yardbirds, that was Clapton. Clapton is he's a rock he's a rock guitarist, but all of his influences were just all rooted in the blues. He had only blues influences. His whole career, he's been looking for the most authentic blues unit. And really he never found it, through, Cream and, even though Cream was like a pretty bluesy band, there was still rock, psychedelic rock. He was trying to find that blues unit. He never found it, you know, with Cream, he never found it with Derek and the Dominoes, even John Mayall, he really wasn't what he was looking for. But by the time he was out of all those bands, he really changed his sound dramatically. And, that's when you get Slow Hand. That's when you get all his later stuff. Which is again is great. It's crazy how much, how much he's changed over the years. Speaking of change, the second guitar player in the Yardbirds is Jeff Beck. Now, not a lot of people know who Jeff Beck is. If you're an avid fan of rock, or music in general, old music, you might know the names Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page. But Jeff Beck really is one that goes unnoticed, you know, for some reason. And I guess it's because his music isn't really as conventional as Clapton's or Jimmy Page's. Um, he had a lot of jazz influences. He played a style of music called fusion, which is literally a fusion between rock and jazz. Um, but Jeff Beck was a second guitar player in the Yardbirds, and after he left the Yardbirds, he literally went into the stratosphere. I mean, he went just above and beyond ever since he was in the Yardbirds. Every single album that guy put out, um, was they're all drastically different. They are. It's his playing changed on every album. Um, he's had just a phenomenal career. To this day, he's still changing with every album he puts out. He's a phenomenal player. He's, in my opinion, I'd say the second greatest guitarist of all time. He's better than Clapton. He's definitely better than Jimmy Page. Um, I would just say on an impact level, he doesn't beat Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix, beats everybody in that arena. But yeah, Jeff Beck he's the most unique player out of those three guys. He has the most unique tone, most unique playing style, um, most unique, the way his songwriting is the most unique. I mean, he's a jazz musician. Right? He has jazz roots. So unlike Clapton, where it's more blues based, more, it's easier to like Clapton's music rather than it is to, like Jeff Beck. There's a lot of weird chord changes. It's jazz. Like it's jazz. A lot of people don't like jazz. Jazz has that thing, but Jeff Beck was easily the best player out of those three. He's the most unique. Like I said, best sound, best tone. He just had the most. He had the craziest guitar lines. He was the most melodic, really. But, then you get to Jimmy Page after Jeff Beck, and there was actually a point in the Yardbirds, you know, history where Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck were in the band at the same exact time, which was pretty cool. I like that because it really shows you where the band how they were thinking, because Jimmy Page is this amazing guitar player, and we'll talk about him, but, it just goes to show that they were thinking, okay, I don't have to be this guitar god. I'll play bass, is what Jimmy Page said. Jeff Beck, you take over the guitar. It just whatever we can do to make the band work. I really liked that about, that that period in the band where Jimmy Page is on bass rather than guitar. But Jimmy Page was already, by the time he got into the Yardbirds, and this is the mid '60s we're talking about, he was already an accomplished studio musician. He did, just a lot of work on, records and songs that, you know, a lot of them we all know, but you don't really know the musicians that, played guitar and played all these instruments behind, like some of these huge solo artists of the '60s, like Joe Cocker and people like that. Jimmy Page was playing on all these songs, you know, but he was already an accomplished studio musician. And the thing about Jimmy Page is he had a wide range of influences. His influences were very eclectic. He loved Celtic music. He loved folk music. He liked some jazz, but he loved blues. Obviously, pretty much everybody loved blues at the time. But his influences were very eclectic, and it showed in his playing and his songwriting. Um, Jimmy was the best out of those three. He was the best writer. He was the best arranger. He was a phenomenal producer. He produced all of Led Zeppelin's albums. Great player of parts. That's what really makes a studio musician, you know, great. You could play parts, you could read music, you can do whatever the artist wants you to do. And that really showed even in throughout Zeppelin's history. He was just a great, riff writer. That's really what people, describe him as. He wrote great riffs. He wrote great, you know, he didn't really write his solos. He improvised a lot of them. And you can tell, people say he's a sloppy player. That's fair to say, but I like that about him. That's what everybody likes about him. It seemed more real, he was tripping over the strings a lot, especially live. But, I like that. He didn't play any wrong notes. He was just sloppy, but he's almost, as impactful as well, he is as impactful as Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton. Um, but after the Yardbirds, Jimmy Page, decides, hey, I want to start my own band, my own version of the Yardbirds. To the point where he almost called his new band the New Yardbirds. Which would that have been a great name? Probably not. I don't think so. But he decided to form this new band, and that band uh, was, to be known as Led Zeppelin, which to this day is considered one of the greatest rock and roll bands, if not the greatest, in my opinion, of all time. And he was extremely ambitious. He wanted the best musicians to be in his band. As I said, he was an accomplished studio musician, so he knew a lot of musicians already. One by the name of John Paul Jones, who was, you could say, just um, a phenomenal multi instrumentalist. But he was his main focus was bass, and that's really what Jimmy Page was trying to get him to do. So he asked John Paul Jones if he wants to be in his band. He agreed. They were friends from the studio world. So John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page are to form a band, which is to be known as Led Zeppelin. They want to get a singer. Their first choice was actually a guy by the name of Terry Reid, who is just a phenomenal singer. He really didn't go. He really wasn't too He isn't popular now. Like a lot of people are like, who the heck is Terry Reid? But he was Jimmy Page's first choice. He has a phenomenal voice. He's released some, good stuff over the years, more folky stuff. It's not really that Led Zeppelin sound we're used to, that hard rock heavy stuff. But he eventually stumbled across a singer named Robert Plant. And Robert Plant was in a band with a guy named John Bonham. And, they were pretty much like mind blowing. Um, According to Jimmy Page. They're, looking back on their stuff with Led Zeppelin, it's just mind blowing how all of these musicians, Jimmy Page was recruiting, were they're great. They're literally the best at what they do. That's the thing about that band. It's like Jimmy Page is one of the greatest guitarists of all time. John Paul Jones, one of the greatest, if not the greatest rock bassist of all time. Um, Robert Plant, greatest rock singer. John Bonham, greatest rock drummer, you know? Jimmy Page knew what he was doing when he was finding these people. He knew that he had to find the perfect people. Plus, Jimmy Page already had credibility, so it was much easier for him to, sway people to join his band. But, yeah, and that's how Led Zeppelin was formed. And, in '69, he formed the band '68, '69, they released their first album. That's all going back to the thing. At that time, musicians were it's much different than it is now. They really didn't have a lot of studio time back in the day. You really had to earn your studio time. Um, but that just goes to show, how hard of, how hard of, workers they were back then. Um, that they can cut an album in, a few weeks, few days, like all these bands were doing it back then. They had 2 albums out, Led Zeppelin actually in '69, Led Zeppelin 1 and then Led Zeppelin 2 were both released in 1969, then 3 was in 1970, and then 4 was in 1971. Bands and artists don't do that these days. You release an album 1 year, and then, 2 years, you go on tour, you do this and that, you have to start writing again, um, and it's, a few years between albums, and they didn't work like that back then. Back then, you released an album, you went on tour. While you were touring, you were writing. While you were touring, you were also recording. So by the time, your tour was over, there was an album out already. And, that's just a great thing about music back then. It's just that people were dedicated to their work. Not that they aren't now, but it's just that they were so and you know the pressures from record companies do have a lot to do with, how fast albums came out back then. But, it's just amazing to see how quick, bands would be putting out albums, and Led Zeppelin's a great example of that. The Beatles are another great example of that. The Beatles were, around for what, 6, 7 years? They have like 12 albums, It's insane. And, obviously everybody knows the Beatles. Those are some of the greatest albums of all time. But that's the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds, in my opinion, the most influential band, at least guitar band. I don't know what that means, but the most influential band in terms of just who came through that band. You had Eric Clapton, who's one of the greatest, Jeff Beck, who's one of the greatest, Jimmy Page, who's one of the greatest. It's like it's almost not even it's hard to believe. Um, but that's the thing. Like it was such a small scene back then where all these musicians were hanging around in the same clubs, at the same places. You don't really get that nowadays because people the internet is really, at everybody's disposal where everybody was at the time were learning from one another, Jimmy Page and, Clapton and all these guys would go and see Hendrix, and then they would go home and be like, "Oh my god, how am I gonna, top this guy?" So they would do the best that they can to, just be the best, be try and beat they were trying to one up each other. It was a friendly competition, but look where it got all of them, They all became the greatest of all time. And that's just something I find so phenomenal about the scene back then and about, the whole classic rock era, is that it was much more genuine than music is now. And I don't want to discredit all the musicians now, but it's like there was a drive that they had then that musicians just don't have now. And it's evident when you look back on that music and you look at the music now. Obviously, there are much more, you know, you got like Pro Tools and things like that where people aren't recording on tape anymore. Obviously, you have computers and things, but back then it was just all the more genuine in almost every single aspect. Um, but that being said, um, the the bands of the '60s, especially the Yardbirds, were just they didn't even realize that they were what how like what how great these guitarists were. You look back on them now and you see, the impact that these guys have had. Clapton, of course, is a blues player. He's not really he's not a fast guitar player. He's more Clapton is one of those guitar players for me that just like they just like he just splits my heart. There are very few guitar players that can do that for me, and for a lot of people, he just it's a guitar player that he's a guitar player that hits you, in the feels pretty much. Every He's not a fast player. He really goes for emotion rather than, making you go, wow, like he's a great guitar because you do that, but he really makes you feel something when he plays. Jimi Hendrix is the same way. David Gilmour of Pink Floyd is the exact same way. He every single solo that guy has played, you know, he takes you somewhere when he plays. That's what Clapton does. That's what Hendrix does. They take you somewhere that you're not. They make you listen, and they make you feel something when you listen to their guitar playing, which is something that I feel especially a lot of guitar players now aren't going for. You see all these guitar players on, YouTube and TikTok and things like that, where they're just trying to play as fast as possible. They have these guitars with like 8 or 9 strings on them, and they're just shredding mindlessly, but there's no feel. You don't really feel anything when you're watching them. You're just seeing, these guys' fingers move super fast and playing all these crazy modal lines. Um, Guitars back then were simple. They got straight to the point. They made you feel something, and they left you, in a state of, just wonderment. They made you so they really captured you in a way that, not many guitarists can, or have been able to since. Um, and yeah, Jeff Beck was sort of the same way. Um, but his style was a little unconventional for the rock scene, at least. Like I said, he was a jazz player. He really didn't he really didn't he wasn't so mainstream in the sense that he wasn't on the radio all the time like Led Zeppelin was. I mean, Led Zeppelin, every album they had, um they were on the radio, which is ironic because they didn't make any singles. They refused to make singles. And Clapton was, he was radio gold. People loved Clapton, especially, later in the 70s and into the 80s. Um, but yeah, those guitar players at that time were really, that was the golden era, in my opinion, of it was the golden age of guitar playing, and into the 80s, you got the, you know, heavy metal was really taking over, and you got more of those guitar players that were focusing on playing fast. They were all trying to copy, Eddie Van Halen. They were all trying to, you know, tap on the guitar neck. They were all trying to do that tapping thing that Eddie was doing, and it was working. They all sold records, but it really didn't feel the same way, um, it did in this with the 70s and 60s guitar players like Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, David Gilmour, Pete Townsend to an extent. And then when you got into the 90s, it really those 90s, those grunge players really is what they were. It was grunge music. It really did bring it back to the guitar playing of the 70s. You look at guitar solos on songs like Alive by Pearl Jam, Yellow Ledbetter by Pearl Jam, a lot of Alice in Chains stuff, all those guitar solos, they really brought it back to that, um, not that simplistic, uh, form of playing anymore. It never really was simplistic, but it just really they just put a lot more feel into their guitar playing rather than a lot of the, metal players and, even some jazz players to some extent, because there was a lot of improvising. There was a lot of, off the cuff, fast lines that really wanted you to, impress you. They wanted to impress you with how fast they can play, which is great. And I'm impressed. But, it really, the guitar players of the 60s and 70s were really the absolute best, in my opinion. But, that's just a short little history on, you know, Clapton and, his impact on the scene. His impact was great, he is one of the greatest of all time. Um, like I said, he's a little overrated, especially compared to Page and Beck, who, Page and Beck, especially Jimmy Page, they're just his discography is just much, um, more impactful. It really is. You can't really think about classic rock without thinking of Led Zeppelin, and if you're not too familiar with Led Zeppelin, you know, what you're hearing is, Jimmy Page's guitar playing and writing. He wrote mostly every song, he produced every album. He They're my favorite band of all time. And then Jeff Beck he's the same way. It's just that he had that impact that Led Zeppelin has, just really to a select audience. Um, but those are really the some of the greatest players to pick up the instrument, especially in the rock scene. Um, but, you know, I would say that well, let me just rattle off, I guess, some of my favorite guitar players, and, we can talk about them for a little bit. Clapton wouldn't even be on the list of, let's say, a top 5. He really his nickname was and, I said that, playing slow rather than fast is not a bad thing, but, Clapton's name was literally Slowhand. That was his nickname. They called him Slowhand because he was a slow player. He really couldn't play fast, and which is great. He did capture that emotion in his playing, but sometimes it can be a little, um, I don't know how you could call it poppy, I guess. On songs like "Wonderful Tonight," which I love that song, but it's really, it's nothing really compared to in terms of rock. It's nothing really compared to what Jimmy Page has done. Um, who happens to be my favorite guitarist. Jimmy Page is a guitarist who is um he wears his influences on his sleeve. And you can tell by his work in Led Zeppelin. Even on the first album, you had songs like Black Mountainside, which is basically an acoustic Celtic folk tune, you know. No vocals, just him and a guitar, an acoustic guitar. He had this weird open tuning that he would use on a lot of songs. Um, and that was sort of his deal. He really liked to express all the influences that all the musicians that he liked. He loved musicians like Roy Harper and, like I said, all that Celtic stuff. Um, before the Yardbirds, he was in a skiffle group. Skiffle is really just like a form of, I guess you could call it pop music that's, really upbeat. They rely a lot on acoustic guitars, kind of folky. And then, obviously he really redefined, or I should say defined hard rock, with the rest of their discography, songs like Communication Breakdown and Good Times, Bad Times and Whole Lot of Love and all that stuff. Um, he has some of the greatest guitar solos of all time. There's that one little song that, people, it's not too popular, but, I think it's pretty good. That song Stairway to Heaven. Yeah, it's a good one for sure, especially that guitar solo. Yeah, it's pretty good. Um, but, you listen to that one song, I mean, and you kinda can't, it's hard to say that that guy hasn't, you know, just changed the rock scene, like all of music. It's tough to say that without listening to when listening to songs like, Stairway to Heaven or Over the Hills and Far Away, and a song like Kashmir, which is such like a complex song just in terms of, songwriting and all the arrangements. And, that song is, um I don't know if a lot of you study music, but um the song's time signature, or at least the guitar, and the synth and the key part, they're in 3/4, whereas the drums are playing in 4/4. So what that does is that makes that the beat on the one stick out, because the guitar is going 1, 2, 3, 4, and the drums are going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and they only line up on one beat, every 12 measures or so. I don't know the math, but so it really does it just a song like that, you don't even notice it, you just have to you really have to listen, and it just really makes it you can really you really appreciate um what he's doing, what the whole band's doing, pretty much on every single song. That's my Jimmy Page is my favorite guitar player. um I'd say my second favorite guitar player, um probably, um it's tough to say who my second favorite would be. I might actually go Jimi Hendrix as my second favorite guitar player. He is there's not much to say about him, only that he's considered by everybody to be the greatest of all time. Um, and then again, it's one of those things. He only released 3 albums. He released 3 albums, and he's considered the greatest of all time. He died in 1970. His first album came out in '67, yet he's still considered the greatest guitarist of all time. That sort of thing blows my mind, and that's really inspiring. Um, but he wrote one of my favorite guitar solos of all time, and it's probably one many people wouldn't expect to be the best, or what I consider to be the best Hendrix solo, and it's on the song "Bold as Love" from this album Axis Bold as Love. Um, that's one of those solos that really encapsulates everything that Jimi Hendrix is, and everything you think of when you think of Jimi Hendrix's playing and style and tone. Um, and of course, his first album, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Are You Experienced, changed the whole music scene, you know, with songs like Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, um, Manic Depression, Red House, all that stuff. Um, Fire. He is so it's almost hard to explain how impactful this guy was, only because um he really changed the way people look at the guitar as an instrument, the electric guitar. Um, in rock music, obviously, there are jazz players and folk players who obviously didn't draw inspiration from Hendrix, but the way Jimmy would play the guitar was unlike anything anybody had ever seen ever. You know, he would at some points play the guitar with his teeth, play behind his head. He would do crazy stuff. He would turn the guitar upside down, you know, and play with the strings like in reverse order. It's crazy the stuff that this guy did. But beside all those, all the theatrical stuff that he would do, he was just a great player. Almost everything he played, it was without mistake. He didn't really make mistakes. He was one of those guys that didn't make mistakes when he played, and it was all he improvised everything. It was all felt, and that's really what defines a great guitar player. It's that you can feel a guitar solo, you can feel something, um, and just, you know, put it, you could put it through your fingers and through, through the strings and out the amp. You can make somebody feel an emotion when you play. And that's what Jimi Hendrix did. I mean, that's what Jimmy Page did as well, but that's what Hendrix's that's really what his thing was. I mean, he it's I'm left speechless at the guy. He was you really can't describe how good of a guitar player he is without actually hearing the music. Um, but that's he's my second favorite, and then I'd probably go for my third favorite, Alex Lifeson of Rush. Now Alex Lifeson is probably he's generally considered the most underrated guitar player of all time. That's pretty much his whole like thing. Like that's his whole shtick. Like he's literally the most underrated of all time, only because Rush was huge. The band Rush was huge in the 70s, and even into the 80s. They were a huge band. Um, but as a player, he really wasn't acknowledged as much as he should have been, even in like a huge band like Rush was. Um, he Rush was a progressive rock band. um, meaning basically that their music was a little bit more complex than a band like Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, or even though Pink Floyd is considered a little progressive. Um, Rush's sound was definitely more complex than Hendrix's, which is pretty much, straight blues like Clapton. Um, but, Alex Lifeson had solos that you were that were better than, you know, that were faster and, more melodic than anything that came after him or before him. Like, he was playing in a way that really wasn't he's like Hendrix in that way. He was playing things that really were never played before. He was playing in a way that was never played before. He was playing a style of music that really wasn't or a style of guitar, I should say, that really wasn't played before. Like I said, like Hendrix. Um, but, he was definitely, I would say, the, father of or grandfather of, conceptual metal, that you would see in the '80s. He is really that one guitar player that inspired, everybody and, um, anybody in, the '80s metal scene, typically, the thrash metal scene like Metallica and, Anthrax and all those guys rather than, like the hair metal thing, which was super huge, Motley Crue and Poison and people like that. But Alex Lifeson really is, underrated is even like an understatement. Like, people don't like, he should be like a at least top 20 greatest guitarist of all time. And, Rolling Stone magazine, which, they aren't, they aren't that great of a credible source. They have him at like 99 out of 100, which is just absurd. He should be in the top 20. Um, but Alex Lifeson is, he's an amazing songwriter, an amazing he wrote his solos, and that's something you can tell. And you could tell that he really was focused on just capturing your just like grabbing your attention immediately with all of his solos. Songs like La Via Strangiato off the Hemispheres album is a masterpiece, to say the least. Masterpiece. Um, his guitar playing on that is, it's tough to beat. It really is, especially in the progressive rock world. That's pretty much as good as it gets, in terms of guitar playing and songwriting too. He wrote that whole thing. It's an instrumental, no vocals. It's 11 minutes too, which is, pretty crazy. You didn't really hear that on the radio. Um, but yeah, that's Alex Lifeson for you. I mean, he wrote just some of the greatest solos of all time. Really melodic solos too. He really didn't rely on the blues scale as much as somebody like Jimmy Page or Jimi Hendrix or Clapton. He's like Jeff Beck in that way, actually, where he's more of um, a soloist whose playing was not so. You really couldn't tell what the influences were, behind what he was playing. You saw the influences of Clapton and you saw the influences of Page pretty much, through their playing. But Alex Lifeson, he was his own thing, Even Jimi Hendrix, you can tell who the influences were. Lifeson, you couldn't, that was who he was. He was Alex Lifeson. I'd say my fourth favorite guitar player is Ace Frehley of Kiss, who is, again, he's really not. He's a very underrated player. Is he as underrated as Alex Lifeson? No. Um, People, um, don't give Kiss as much credit as they should be due. People really write them off only because of, they're they're a very theatrical band. If you don't know who Kiss is, if you do know who Kiss is, you would agree with that 100%. But they're a extremely theatrical band with all the makeup and, just the entire show. I saw a show and it was probably the greatest show I've ever seen. The music was good, but like the show in general, the pyro and the light show, it's the best as it really can get. Um, but Ace Frehley, um, would I say he's like deserving of like, a top 20 spot? Like, Alex Lifeson? Probably not. There are a lot of guitarists who are better than him, but he really inspired me um, more so than pretty much any other guitar player. I'd say he and Jimmy Page did. Um, he was. I mean, Kiss was the first band I really ever got into. And Ace Frehley, his solos were much different than everybody else's on the list, only because he had solos you can sing. He really like I can sit here and hum like almost every single guitar solo that did, and he did. And that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to write a solo that was pretty much like the pretty much another melody in the song, while still being just an awesome guitar solo. It's that's really what he was best at, and he he inspired a lot of again, he was one of those guitarists that inspired a lot of metal players, um, which is pretty interesting. Kiss is, considered one of those early metal influences. Some of them even say they're a metal band. I wouldn't go that far, but Ace is definitely one of the best, I think, in the sense that he can write a solo that you remember. You know, um, Alex Lifeson is great. He plays a lot of complex stuff. But if you asked me to like hum you one of his solos or sing you one of his solos, I couldn't do it for my life. If my life depended on it, couldn't do it. Ace Frehley, however, almost every single solo, I'd say every single solo that guy did, you know, you remember, and that's really what I love about him. And he had the coolest stage presence out of all those guys. Cooler than Gene, in my opinion. I mean, he would take like these super long guitar solos, and he'd have this thing where there would smoke would come out of his guitar and it would look, like his guitar was on fire. It's just awesome stuff like that he would do. Um, he would shoot rockets out of his guitar while he was playing a guitar solo. You know, is really, what's not to love about the guy. That's another guy who's considered to be a somewhat sloppy player, like Jimmy Page. Where they're chipping over the strings a whole bunch, especially live. But again, and I like that thing. I like that. A lot of people do. It seems more real, seems much more genuine than, these quote, these perfect players. Like I consider Alex Lifeson to be a perfect player, which is also good. It's great to be, that virtuoso. It's great to be that master. Um, but it's also great to see, someone who's, you know, sloppy, a little sloppy, rough around the edges, but everything he wrote, everything he played was phenomenal. And I'm not, discrediting his live performances because I like them, but that's really one criticism about him, which I don't even think um he deserves that criticism, because then again, like people like him and Page are considered sloppy, but, you know, Page is still considered like one of the greatest, if, probably top 3 guitarists of all time. So it's really not a fair criticism at all, to call him sloppy, because it's not a bad thing, you know? It's a good thing. Um, but Ace is, great in my opinion. I know a lot of people don't share share my love for Kiss. They're actually quite a hated band. Um, they really haven't made many great decisions over the past few years, but that classic lineup of the band in the 70s was, insane. It was unbeatable pretty much. But he's my 4th, and I'd say my 5th is probably David Gilmour of Pink Floyd. And I mentioned him before, and he's really, you know, just he's another one that's hard to explain, because Pink Floyd's music, um, if you're not familiar with it, is it's very psychedelic. It's very ethereal at times. Songs like "Shine on You, Crazy Diamond" and "Comfortably Numb," you know, they're very reliant on emotion, more so than anything else. Um, and that goes for his guitar playing too. It's really it's he doesn't he can say a lot with 2 or 3 notes, which is something that many other guitar players can't do. They need a lot of notes to, hold your attention or, make you, appreciate what they can do. He's not like that. He really can hit you in a way that many other guitar players can't. Um, his music is or his guitar solos, I should say, are really, soulful. They rely a lot on mood. They, his tone was impeccable, throughout the whole band's discography, throughout the whole time he was in the band. His tone was just incredible. You look at a song like "Shine On You Crazy Diamond," that little guitar part, I think, is the greatest, guitar sound ever, put to tape. That's one of the greatest, at least Strat sounds. Um, he's really a guy who's, um, he really hit the nail on the head when, he said he probably, I'd say, doesn't write his guitar solos. He relies a lot on improvisation, but, he's one of those guys that can, like, I keep going back to Jimmy Page because he's my favorite, but Jimmy Page improvised all his guitar solos, right? But, you know, he was a guy that really, his guitar solos were complex in the sense that they weren't, like, Gilmore's guitar solos were simple, They were simple in terms of, if you're looking at the music, the notes he's playing, they're not tough notes, they're not tough lines to play, but the thing is he hits the right note at the right time, and a lot of guitar players, you know, don't really do that as much as they should, um, or they can't even, Gilmore just had that in him. He had that feel. You could see it when he's playing. He's just in another place. Clapton's the same way. When I saw him on Sunday, um, every guitar solo he played, he looked like he was, somewhere else. He was in the zone, and that's really something you can't fake, and Gilmore had that in spades. Every solo he played, he just he took you somewhere else. You listen to a solo on Time, um, Comfortably Numb is considered the greatest guitar solo of all time. Um, would I say it's the greatest? No. I'd I'd throw Stairway to Heaven, right before that, but, Comfortably Numb is obviously great. Um, but Gilmore is really he really and I wouldn't even call him, um, he wasn't like a heavy inspiration on me as a guitar player, because I don't really play I mean, I can't really play, not many people can play in the way that he does. I'd say, Jimmy Page was definitely the, heaviest influence on me, just in the way that I play, it's pretty much all of his licks verbatim, which, isn't a bad thing, but, it's good to develop your own style, and that's actually another thing Page was, actually all of these guys, um, were very good at. They all had their own sound. They all had their own style. You hear their guitar playing, you know who it is. You don't even have to hear them playing. You just even tonally, they knew what a good tone was and they stuck with that. And that was, you know, that's just something great about all these guitar players. A lot of the guitar players back in the day. You like take Tom Schultz, for example. You hear a Tom Schultz guitar line, you can hear one note and it's a Boston song, you know? Um, that's really what all of these guitar players were, really good at. Um, and, yeah, um, and, I'd like to, maybe throw in, just from a rhythmic aspect, James Hetfield of Metallica. Um, I'm a huge Metallica fan, and he pretty much inspired me, as a rhythm guitar player more than all of the, my top 5 guitar players have. Only because, he had a right hand, picking hand that really didn't, you know, that really, it was really powerful, and he really could. he held down every single Metallica song. As good as Kirk Hammett was, he was really the sole force on the guitar behind that, entire band's discography. But, those are my top 5 favorite guitar players. That was a little short history on, Clapton and Page and Beck and, you know, a history on, the Yardbirds, who I consider to be probably the most influential band of all time. They had 3 of the greatest guitar players go right through that band within the span of 2 or 3 years. I think that's amazing. Um, but yeah, that pretty much wraps up the show, my first episode, which was pretty fun, really exciting. I hope you guys stay tuned. We'll, talk about some great music every single episode. Probably, sometimes we'll talk about a specific album for an entire episode. Maybe I'll like list my favorite albums one time, list my favorite bands. We did my guitar players today, so maybe we'll do like an album list one time or whatever. We'll figure it out. Um, but yeah, that's it was, and maybe we'll do like different musicians, like singers, bass players, drummers, things like that. We have it all to figure it out. But yeah, thank you guys for listening. I hope you come back. I hope there are a decent number of rock fans out there. Um, and yeah, that's pretty much it. That wraps up the whole show. And hope you learned something about some good music. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I guess I hope I'll see you guys next time. And thank you for listening.